This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Auntie webinar. We will give just a few moments for people to come online, and then we will begin with today's topic about psychological safety at work. A very relevant topic for all of us. So really looking forward to this one. Before we begin, I want to remind you that your microphones are on mute. So if you have any questions, you are free to write them in the chat box or in the Q&A section. And we will leave a few moments in the end to go through some of the questions. I'm sorry, we can't possibly go through all of the questions, but to write them down in the Q&A. Our expert for today is Margaretha Madoures. Welcome also, Margaretha. And the topic, of course, is psychological safety at work. So understanding what does this mean and how do you promote it in your own workplace. As we might have people online who are not familiar with Auntie, I want to remind you also that Auntie is a service that offers psychological conversational support to tackle those everyday issues and problems that most of us tend to face at some point in our lives. But without further ado, we are 1 minute over our starting time, so I will give the stage to our expert, Margaretha. The stage is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mikael. Yes, so welcome to this 30-minute webinar on psychological safety. As Mikael already said, my name is Margaretha Madoures. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology. I'm also a licensed relaxation therapist, and I've been working as an Auntie professional, giving you that, one of the people helping you with that support that Mikael mentioned. Except from that, I also occasionally write blog posts for Auntie, and I help to give webinars such as this one. What are we going to talk about today? So first, I'm going to go a little bit into the general concept of psychological safety. Next, I'm going to be talking about the benefits that you can notice once you are in a psychologically safe work community. Then we're talking specifically about attitudes towards mistakes. And further, after that, we're going to talk about the application in practice. Of course, that's what you want, right? And finally, I hope to have some time for comments and questions. So let's start. So first, we're going to talk about the concept itself. So what is psychological safety? It's generally speaking the experience of being in a group and not being afraid to make mistakes. In a psychologically safe work community, you will feel that you can make mistakes, that you can bring up your own opinions without being afraid of being unnecessarily criticized and getting some kind of negative responses that generally don't feel very safe. In an unsafe environment, you don't always have that. Another thing that you can focus on in a psychologically safe working community is that you can focus on common goals rather than this self-protection that we fall into when we are working in an unsafe environment. So let's talk about the benefits. One of the first benefits that people notice when they are working in psychological safety is that they can learn more easily. We are more relaxed, and therefore we can learn new things and adapt to changes more easily. We also feel that we can experiment and try because we don't have to constantly protect ourselves and avoid making mistakes. We can share our thoughts and ideas more freely, and therefore also hear more in general thoughts and ideas. It's also easier to make decisions, because when you're not constantly afraid that you're stepping on someone's shoes, or that some opinions or decisions might be the wrong ones to go for, then it is generally easier to come to a conclusion. You can also showcase your expertise more easily, because you're not afraid that others will call you arrogant for maybe showing what you can do. You're also cooperating more easily, because you're not so much focused on protecting yourself. Instead, you, as I mentioned before, can focus on common goals rather than only on your own survival. And second to last, you can address problems more easily, because when you are able to talk about problems without being afraid that someone's going to attack you for bringing them up, it's more easy to address them. And finally, it is easier to solve those problems as well, because if we are in a state that allows us to address problems and also make changes and learn to live with these new changes, it's easier to also solve the problems in the long term. So I would like to challenge you and make you think for a moment about ways that psychological safety can affect you and your work experience more positively. So the first question I would like you to ask yourself is, how would an increase in psychological safety affect your own behavior in everyday work? What would change for you? The second question that I'd like you to think briefly about is, what kind of things would it promote in your workplace? What would you have more of? What things would maybe even on the negative sides decrease? And finally, we have the question, how can you do your part to strengthen the psychological safety in your work community? And this last part is often a tricky question, so don't worry, we'll get to that, and hopefully leave this webinar with some ideas of what you can do and to help to promote psychological safety in your work community. Okay, so next we're going to talk about this very important part of psychological safety, and it is the attitude towards mistakes. In a more traditional work environment, which often isn't very psychologically safe, we often ask the question, who is to blame for the mistakes, or who's to blame that things are not running smoothly? In a psychological safe environment, we actually shift the focus to what happened. What is it that made this problem appear? Rather than this, again, self-protective mode of I'm not to blame, who's to blame? We're shifting to a more curious approach and asking, okay, what happened? How can we prevent this in the future? Rather than trying to find someone who is to blame. Generally speaking, an unsafe work culture is often one where a culture of fear continues. So here's a couple of things that you might notice in a culture that is not safe. So the first thing is that mistakes are being punished. So, which of course, what happens if you punish a mistake, then people are less likely to admit that they have made mistakes. That goes along with accusations. When you're, again, blaming people for making mistakes, then they're less likely to come out with them if they have happened. That also goes along with the next point. So they're withholding information in a work culture that is not safe. You don't only withhold necessarily when you're making a mistake or when someone you maybe like in your work environment has made a mistake, but you're also withholding information such as special skills that you have that could actually lead to solving problems or changing things in the work culture to a positive in a positive direction. Also, what we see more often is that it is more likely that people shoot each other's ideas down. So, which again increases that feeling of, okay, I'd rather not speak up because I might get shot down and they might not appreciate my input. Then you have cliques, you have a very specific in and out group dynamic that is not healthy at all in a work culture. So you have groups that kind of bond together and maybe also make people who are not in that group feel less safe. You're also talking over each other. So as you can see, in a psychologically safe work environment, you respect each other even on this very small scale. In meetings, for example, you don't interrupt each other, but you are respectful towards each other. Let each other finish before you give your own ideas. Gossiping in general is also a good sign that you might not be in a completely psychologically safe work environment yet. Then generally bullying, if you notice that might also be an indicator. Hushing things up rather than bringing them to the surface in order to solve issues. And then finally, we have the point of fear of giving feedback, because if you are scared that if you're giving feedback, you'll get a very negative response, then you're more likely to not give feedback at all, which of course allows then for problems to continue existing. So here's a couple of ways that in a psychological safe environment, we would shift from this blame game to a culture of psychological safety. And that can also be looked at from, let's learn from mistakes. So generally, as I mentioned, in a lot of traditional work communities, there is this overarching feeling of that mistakes aren't allowed. But what we really want is that mistakes are, well, the reality is that mistakes are almost impossible to avoid. And in order to expand and grow as a work community, mistakes will happen occasionally, but that also means that we were in the process of creative work, in the process of experimenting and trying new things, that we allow ourselves to make mistakes, right? Okay, so then there is this rule of an effective employee does not make mistakes, which is of course not helpful, because again, it stops us from even trying, or it decreases the likelihood that people will try and experiment and learn and expand. So what I'd like to happen is for it to shift to the idea that an effective employee can make mistakes, but then also learn from them, and ideally then share their learnings with others so that similar mistakes can be prevented in the future. And then also we have the goal, this idea that the goal is to prevent errors. Again, this is directed by fear. We want to avoid that because again, it cages us in an attitude that prevents us from growing. So what we want to shift to instead is that the goal is to promote rapid learning rather than to prevent errors. And finally, we have the idea that mistakes are covered up or to protect oneself. In a psychologically safe work environment, you don't really have the need, or you don't feel that you need to protect yourself constantly. And that will allow for an open discussion, again, more quick and rapid learning, and overall innovation over time, which of course is something that we all want. So let's talk about the thing that you probably came here for. So what can I do? What can others do to help promote psychological safety in my work community? So just generally speaking again, is that psychological safety allows for the basics to work, right? In a psychological safe work environment, we are more likely to get to working frames and structures that work, right? That don't stand in the way of you doing your job effectively. On the other hand, we also have this part of individual needs that is more likely to flourish in psychological safety. So you're more likely that you have a culture of acceptance and sympathy. You encourage each other and support each other. And also you are able to get into or experience appropriate challenges. And this is important. It's appropriate challenges, not overwhelming or underwhelming in that sense challenges. And finally, we also get recognition for our achievements. That is also part of a psychologically safe work environment. So what this does is it creates predictability. And sometimes this has a bit of a negative connotation. And that's not what I mean by that. Predictability is the ability to predict what is going to happen. Well, yeah. So what that means is that you're not constantly afraid that something unexpected might happen. You, in a psychologically safe environment, you know that if you do this, that you can expect these outcomes. And if you're making mistakes, you don't have to worry about what possible outcomes of that might be, that you might be blamed or people get angry at you for making mistakes. Rather, it is a work culture of acceptance. One other important part of psychological safety is compassion, because a psychologically safe environment, one is a compassionate one. So generally speaking, compassion is the ability to put oneself in another's shoes and experience things from another point of view and act accordingly. Does that mean that we all have to constantly ask how we are? Which, I mean, if we were to drive this idea to an extreme, could come to a point where we don't really get anything done because we're constantly checking in with each other. No, but it's this overall awareness that we are curating to help each other experience a pleasant work environment, right? So let's talk about things that everyone can do first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically what leaders can do. So what everyone can do is try and respect different opinions. You don't have to have the same opinion all the time, but it is your job as a psychologically safe colleague to respect different opinions. It's also important to ask for feedback and encourage others to comment on your own work, again, in a respectful manner. You are also allowed, and usually you feel that it is okay to show vulnerability and your own fallibility. So if you make mistakes in a psychologically safe work environment, you are probably not as scared as in another type of environment to admit that you have made a mistake. And as I mentioned before, what we want is we want a solution-focused approach rather than blaming each other for making mistakes. This way, it's also much quicker to move on from mistakes and maybe even avoid making these mistakes in the future. It's also easier to raise difficult issues. So your job sometimes is in a psychologically safe environment, i.e. you're feeling safe enough to do so, to raise difficult issues and then allow for them to be discussed respectfully. We also present and are present and interested in others' opinions. And that means even remotely, which of course it's easier to tune out a meeting when it's not face-to-face. But yes, part of a psychologically safe environment is to respect each other enough to be present and interested, even when it's just remote. And then finally, it's this idea of connecting with colleagues as humans. You don't have to be besties with everyone, but see them as humans rather than just as their working role. And that can help to, again, to increase that compassion that I was talking about before. And here's some points that we could that leadership can take to upon. So what's the role of leadership? One of the important roles is to intervene in disputes and help people resolve disagreements. So we want an involved leadership when it is needed and asked for. We also, what we want from psychologically safe leadership style is that the value that's interpersonal skills and are strengthened and valued, and nobody expects you to just be born a perfect leader. Sometimes that may include special training that you can take in order to improve your interpersonal skills. Then we also want everyone to have a turn and enough face-to-face conversations, right? When you're connecting with your team on a regular basis, it's less likely that you're missing something big and missing maybe some undercurrent of problems. So it's important to prioritize this time with your team. Also create opportunities to connect outside of work tasks. Of course, it's not the job of anybody to mandatorily have to attend these kinds of out of work get-togethers, but as a psychologically safe leader tries to create those opportunities so that they can arise. And here's a couple of more points. So another thing that is often difficult for leaders, especially when you're new to the job and maybe have some insecurities yourself, is to show some of those imperfections, right? You want to admit that you are not infallible either. And then generally also you are allowed to point out that mistakes are allowed and that there are opportunities to learn and improve in the future, rather than things that you have to feel ashamed about and maybe even be reminded about for a long time after. And then we also talk about this very important part of giving feedback. The way you give feedback is very important. There's some really nice ideas, I think from Kim Scott about this, of how leaders can give feedback in a way that is compassionate. And except from giving feedback, what we also want to do is we want to acknowledge team members and thank each other for the hard work. And finally, we also want to offer help if you see someone struggling. You don't have to fix it all, but just being there and offering to maybe even figure things out together is often all that's needed. So here are a couple of key takeaways before we have a couple of minutes for questions in the end. So here's one key takeaway. Generally, be open to different opinions. And that might not always be easy, but it's something that you can work on. It's a fairly small thing that we can do on a daily basis. Don't play the blame game. So rather than focusing on who is to blame for mistakes or why things went wrong, ask about the general environment that might have made it more likely that the mistake was made. And then address difficult issues and prioritize connection instead. So first we talk about, we also raise difficult issues. That's again a tricky one for a lot of environments. And then we prioritize connection over blaming again. So we have that human connection that stands in the center of our attention rather than avoiding mistakes. All right, and I think these are some references. And thank you very much for your attention. We have some time for questions now. Sorry.
Thank you, Margaretha. Actually, that the presentation and mentioning the mistakes resonated, and we got questions regarding that one. So could you share any practical ways of pointing out that mistakes are actually allowed, rather than just mentioning that, okay, these are allowed?
Okay. I'm not sure I understand the question completely. Like, do you mean practical ways of how people can make this more clear that it's okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I think this has a lot to do with your own vulnerability. If you're able to yourself admit to making mistakes, sending a very clear sign to others that, hey, I'm not infallible. I'm not expecting for you to be infallible either. So by being vulnerable yourself, you're basically making a very clear signal to others that, okay, it's okay to make mistakes. So in this kind of acting, you can do that. Another way, no, I started that and I can't really think of anything. But yeah, that might be a really good start. Is there another question?
Yeah, so basically being the example yourself. So
Yes.
talking about your own mistakes, maybe.
Yeah.
And then another question actually about psychological safety is that if the situation is really bad or infected, so how would you recommend starting to address this issue and promoting psychological safety?
Yeah. Okay. In environments like that, what I see sometimes is that it has to absolutely come from leadership, because leadership they are the ones that are able to make an impact, and also a quick impact. The work culture is something within the general work community is something that usually takes more time. So there has to be a prioritization from leadership to enhance psychological safety. So one place to start, for example, would be to look at the most burning issues when it comes to an unsafe work environment. What is it that employees or team leads talk about more often, where they see problems, and address these issues first?
Yes. Okay, and then last one, a rather detailed question on a very personal level. So if you have experienced professional love bombing previously, which has caused a lack of safety in workplace, so how could something like this be addressed? So any tips on this one?
Okay, so yeah, that's a very specific question. I don't think, well, I think I have not had this issue come up during sessions before, I think, but of course, love bombing is part of a more general picture, right? It's often part of a quite in a work environment, often in the more abusive work environment. So because this is a part of the manipulation process, my recommendation would be to set firm boundaries, collect data on when this is happening, and even and also data on when then usually the negative response comes afterwards, after the love bombing period, and bring it up with people that you can trust. I would usually recommend HR. I would usually recommend supervisors. If the supervisor's involved, and go one level higher if you feel comfortable with that. But generally, if your own protection in this environment should be the priority. So if you're feeling unsafe because of this type of behavior, then that should be the priority. I know there's no clean, nice, easy answer to that.
Yes, and it is a personal topic also.
Yes.
But I think that is actually a really good idea to gather the information, gather the facts, and then make appropriate advances. And if it's a supervisor who is doing this, then going one step higher,
yeah,
and taking that matter into discussion on that level.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So hey, with that we come to the end of our time period. So I want to thank everyone who has been online, and thank you, Margaretha, for presenting this really relevant topic to us. And I will hopefully see you online for our next webinars in December. So have a great day and have a great rest of the week.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.